September 27th, 2025. Well, President Trump's True Social post on the Ukraine war has kind of it seems to be a 180 over what his attitude, let's say, earlier in his term here in the early 2025, particularly his meeting between Zelensky and him and Vice President Vance, which was created some issues, and so now he's now gone from that basically Ukraine can't win the war to Ukraine can win the war, and maybe can even take some Russian territory as well. And this is kind of the latest thing, which is kind of the ongoing saga of what I might call the Ukraine project, which really dates back to the early 2000s and really got going seriously in 2008 when the Bush administration had proposed bringing both Ukraine and Georgia into the NATO alliance, I guess, and of course that was strongly opposed by Russia, which had cautioned against it for a long time and had tried to warn everybody, don't do this. This only culminated in an effort in 2014, of course, that overthrew the elected government at the time, and this broke out into a certain limited civil war in Russian ethnic regions, which were then supported by the creation of the Wagner Group, which then moved in to help the Russian rebels, if you will, against the Kiev government. And that led to a stalemate and some negotiations and some limited sanctions. And of course, Russia then moved in and seized Crimea. And so that was kind of the way the situation had stalemated for some time. However, I still see that the West is fundamentally what we call the strategic aggressor in this conflict, in that they're pushing into the Russian sphere of influence in a fairly aggressive way, which is potentially detrimental to Russian security. Now, although the somewhat brain-dead news media we have in this country doesn't seem to look into anything beyond the superficial anymore, one has to understand that Ukraine is an actual member of NATO, with NATO forces on the territory, potentially, particularly after the U.S. Withdrew from the INF Treaty, probably largely to make conventional weapons to use against the potential Chinese attack in the Pacific. But nonetheless, this could lead ultimately to the situation where U.S. missiles with potentially nuclear warheads could strike at the key elements of the Russian strategic defenses, only a few hundred kilometers away. So, we might dismiss this whole idea, but from the Russian perspective, and considering their historic paranoia of attacks from the West, after all, it happened repeatedly, the Swedes, the French, and the Germans, right? And of course, all three of those are very much involved in this ongoing anti-Russian position right now. And the way they think, obviously, this is considered a serious threat. Frankly, consider how we reacted to the deployment of Soviet missiles in Cuba in 1962. So I don't think, and they tend to think ahead a little bit. I think that they see what's coming. Now, from a kinetic sense, as they like to say nowadays, obviously Russia is the one that actually used clear-cut military violence first in 2022. But that was only after several attempts to negotiate, which were completely rebuffed by the Biden administration. So this is sort of the general attitude I have toward the conflict. That's not to say that Russia's justified in what they're doing, but I don't think we're justified in what we're doing either. We're both causing trouble for the world, which could lead to a catastrophe. Maybe it won't, maybe it will, but there's a probability there, and I think it's one higher than I would like to contemplate. So at any rate, that's kind of the situation. So now that Trump has now joined the Lindsey Graham school, one thinks superficially, and thinks that we really should, go all out to beat Russia because Russia's a paper tiger and they're losing. Where did that come from? I'm not sure. Certainly, a few Ukrainian drone strikes have disrupted Russian gasoline supplies to a degree that has caused some problems. And of course, we had some problems during the oil crisis in 1973 too. So I don't know though that either one is going to change policy fundamentally. And but at any rate, that's kind of the way I see the situation. And I think there's probably more to it than meets the eye. But if you like these videos, please give me a like, subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. And you can also follow me on Rumble. So, of course, another view on the Trump statement, if read carefully, is a whole different thing, and that is he basically saying that this is a problem for the Europeans to handle, and that the United States will sell to the European nations through NATO weapons that they choose to procure, and then they can, if they choose, provide them to Ukraine, and so that means we're not funding it anymore. Russia, Europe is. And that leads to the question of, well, what is the real status of the conflict in that case? Um, he also made comment about the fact that Ukraine wasn't defeated within a week. Well, I mean, we didn't defeat Afghanistan within a week. In fact, we ultimately lost. And as far as our Iraq effort, I think that's a kind of a some win, some loss. We definitely got rid of Saddam's regime, that's for sure, and did so pretty quickly. However, after that, the aftermath was a bit of a disaster and very much mismanaged, which led to a regime there which is not exactly super friendly to us, but at least one we can cooperate with, and one that's not a threat to our friends in the region, such as the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and so forth. But they may be tilting a little bit toward the Iranians more than one would like. So that's kind of, I think that characterization misjudges the technological nature of the situation. For one thing that developed during this whole period is a certain advance in electronics, which then got applied to military forces in a way that was, it kind of evolved during the war due to necessity. The lithium battery, modern circuitry, miniaturized cameras, the FPV drone, and so forth led to a whole different type of weapon system and conflict, where the modern main battle tank becomes easy prey to fairly cheap attacks, and infantry combat comes at a premium. And so the result is things are sort of like a modern version of World War I trench warfare, although it has a different twist to it for sure. Nonetheless, and a lot has been made about who's doing what and who's taking what. But anybody that follows the war in detail realizes that a lot of what we see in the West is myth. The primary thing I think that's myth is that that Russia's made very little progress. In reality, it's been more of a seesaw. In the early period, Russia, I think, had hoped to basically force negotiations where they've been rebuffed previously by using force, and they were on the verge of actually negotiating a deal which would have probably solved the whole conflict, and basically implemented something like the Minsk II agreements, having some independence for the breakaway Russian ethnic areas in the east, and Russia would still hold Crimea, of course. But the rest of the invasion would pull back and leave their territory and leave them in peace. But what ended up happening is that, of course, their attack ran into roadblocks, and the West decided to provide massive amounts of military equipment to the Ukrainians, who were quite angry and at the time willing to volunteer en masse to fight. And they were able to wage a counterattack through the end of, maybe November or thereabouts of 2022, which basically found them in possession of the Kharkiv region, came back fully into Ukrainian control, and the Russians ended up retreating to defensible lines after their earlier penetrations had come to a stalemate, and were now being pushed back pretty heavily. At the end of that period, there was a sort of a situation where both forces were somewhat spent. But then, of course, the Russians started mobilizing large amounts of reservists, and then started recruiting large numbers of troops and building up. And since basically the end of 2023, they've been on the offensive and been gaining ground hither and various places. It's slow and sure, but they're slowly but surely wearing down the main Ukrainian defense line. So I think that's an ongoing situation. Um, but essentially, with the Trump administration, at least so far, we've seen the end of massive free equipment from the United States, or pretty much has ended up in a trickle. And the new idea is to let Europeans buy weapons, either of their own manufacture or from us, and provide them Ukraine, which are generally in a lower quantity than we've had previously. Um, on the other hand, Ukraine has developed a lot of effective long range drone attacks, which have done some significant damage to Russian infrastructure, destroying or at least degrading their oil production capacity. And this is sort of what Trump was pointing to there, and some of the recent successes there. So we don't know exactly where we're going from here. I remember that prior to that time, in that same period, we've been complaining about a series of Russian attacks, which were obviously trying to destroy a lot of these drone factories, munitions warehouses, and so forth, so that the Ukrainians were basically secreting, if you will, or trying to inside of populated areas. So as it is now, the conflict is ongoing, and there is one little sector north of Pokrovsk where it looks like the Russians may have overextended themselves and could be in danger of having a units cut off in that one area. And all the other areas, pretty much Russia's on the offensive. So, and in fact, maybe that was a sacrifice done to distract the Ukrainians. You never know. Similarly, in a very recent engagement, a series of attacks against Zaporizhia city was carried out, and then the Ukrainians brought in a Patriot system to shoot down one of the Russian airplanes, which then led to the Patriot system itself being destroyed. And economically, of course, the exchange ratio, $1 billion Patriot system for one aircraft, So, at any rate, that's the way it goes. It's an ongoing war of attrition and will probably continue. My own opinion is that I tend to think that the Putin blundered in his reaction after the meeting in Alaska with Trump. Not in that he didn't go for ending the war where it is exactly, but since the whole purpose was of that meeting was supposedly to go to the next stage where there'd be a one-on-one meeting between Putin and Zelensky. Apparently Putin took very little or no action on that. And I think it was pretty clear cut that this meeting, if it had have occurred, would be a failure because neither side is anywhere close to agreeing. And I think that that what would probably have been smarter, in my opinion, would be to go ahead and make the preparatory moves towards such a meeting. Call for a meeting of high-level diplomatic and military personnel to negotiate at a neutral location, maybe at Turkey or wherever, and to see what kind of a deal they could hammer out for such a meeting, which of course would turn out to be non-existent, but they would be going through the right kind of motions and would probably allow President Trump to look a little better domestically from all the hawks that exist in Congress, particularly the Lindsey Graham crowd, if you will. But he didn't do that. For whatever reason, he seems to be trying to play the tough guy approach or something like that. My own thoughts still, I'm still kind of thinking that drone thing into Poland was a false flag to the Ukrainians. Obviously, the three MiGs over Estonia were not a false flag. That really happened. On the other hand, when you look at what really occurred, they were met by a couple of Italian F-35s, and the two sides basically waved their wings at each other by tilting the airplane as a signal, and basically seemed to get along good, and the Russians went on about their way. It's unclear whether the Russians were off course, so they're probably just trying to see what the reaction time would be and things like that, just normal probing type things. By the way, we do stuff like that too, by the way. So anyway, we never say what we do we? We just say what they do. In fact, both militaries do things like that, and it's a normal behavior of them. I don't know why normal behavior on either side is considered so controversial. But at any rate, that's what they do. And so, let's just hope it don't get out of hand. So that's kind of the situation on that. That's my reaction to that. Meanwhile, I think the conflict continues, but I don't really see much in the. I don't see much likelihood that Ukraine is about to win the war in any meaningful way. It seems to me like they're still in the process of slowly but surely losing through attrition. Note that Ukraine is continuing to draft like 60-year-old men and throwing them into the front line. And now they're talking about trying to recruit younger women, 18 to 24. This doesn't sound like a country that's in the process of winning. They are definitely inflicting some damage on Russia, but the question is, what type of action will that provoke Russia to take back? That's what we don't know at this point. It looks like, ever so often they do pull off an interesting sucker punch, which throws Russia off balance for a while. And that may be what just happened in the last week or so. But I don't think that's the end of the game here. And it's unclear to me whether our own weapon production rates and the degree of the Europeans to fund this thing will be enough to turn the tide. Also note that these little provocations, whatever they are, basically I think may have the effect of getting the Europeans more interested in building their own defense. and of course, everything they put there is something that won't go to Ukraine, obviously. So anyhow, we'll see how that plays out. It's interesting. The big issue on the oil front, I think, is interesting that Trump has basically put the onus on Europe, although some of the issues are one that they want Europe to not be importing Russian oil and gas, but most of the Russian oil, I think, is either Turkey or Slovakia and Hungary. And Slovakia and Hungary's oil consumption is insignificant compared to the overall magnitude of the war effort. The real Turkey is fairly significant, however, and I think they may transship some. Then you get into the issue of the big ones, India and China. China is key. Will China actually agree to not take Russian energy? But note that they're already made a deal to create a natural gas pipeline. That doesn't sound like they're going to back off. And as far as I can tell, India hasn't either, although it's hard to tell for sure. And so we'll be monitoring that one, of course, as time goes on. But those are the key things as far as the oil system, or the idea that oil is a kill switch on the Russian operation. I think largely I have to agree a little bit with Dr. Mishheimer, although I have some very disagreements with him about Israel. But on this, I think that they may be correct, that Trump is simply trying to distance himself from the whole issue by shifting the burden to Europe and let things be what they may, figuring that eventually somebody will probably come to their senses and reach a deal. Of course, when it comes down to it, a lot of the main supplies for Ukraine come from outside, whereas the bulk of Russia's capability has to come from inside, and that makes Russia slightly more vulnerable given the degree to which drones can apparently penetrate their airspace pretty much willy-nilly. Why they have not been able to find any defenses against this, they're hard to tell. Similarly, recently, some drones were flying over Denmark. And again, were those Russian drones or were they UAPs? I don't know. That's another issue. But the main point I still look at that here we face a situation where we have the NATO alliance fundamentally in a proxy war against the Russian Federation, which is a nuclear-armed state at near basically nuclear parity. And this is a very, in my opinion, dangerous situation, which could, due to some miscalculation, spin out of hand. Certainly so far the Russians have refrained from using any tactical nuclear weapons, and I think primarily one reason is because they don't need to. The other reason is the fear of escalation, obviously. The other aspect I would look at the conflict is that a lot of things that Russia could do, they're not doing, primarily because of Western naval supremacy. If they're going to sell this oil and have this shadow fleet, they need to basically remain very careful in how they deal with the NATO alliance, because if a real conflict were to break out, even a limited one, certainly a naval blockade might be the first military action that would be put in place, and their ability to transship oil, at least out of the western part of Russia, would be quite limited, and perhaps even, well, the part around China is maybe more precarious, because what if the Chinese start escorting the ships? Then we could be in a war with China too, you know. But at any rate, that's kind of the way I see that. So because of that, they won't do anything like trying to sabotage North Sea oil or sabotage key pipelines that they otherwise could conceivably do, just like somebody sabotaged theirs. We're now claiming it was really 6 Ukrainians in a sailboat, but well, really? Maybe. I don't know. I didn't think so, but we'll wait and see on that one. But anyhow, so I think because of that, their actions will be limited, and so far, it still looks like they're on the march. Although there are going to be limited setbacks in places, and so the thing goes on. One of the things I would like to comment on is Trump's claim that it's like 7,000 people are being killed per day or something. Or is that per week? I forget. But I mean, seriously, I think the casualties aren't that high. But I think they are disproportionately higher on the Ukrainian side than the Russian side most of the time. And the myth of the meat wave attack is just that. Anybody that looks at the videos of these attacks, these are generally being conducted by relatively dispersed small units that seem to have a fairly high degree of aggressiveness to be operating in that environment. Because if you cluster too many people together, the drone comes in and drops a bomb on you, or artillery hits you. So because of that, the horde attack approach isn't being used. But so we can hope for the end of the conflict at some point. But for the moment, I think it's a quagmire for everybody involved, and the unwillingness of anybody on the Ukrainian side to kind of come to realization is limited, in my opinion. The Russians, from their point of view, probably will continue, because I think that it's kind of all on the line for them as a credible power right now. And from the Chinese point of view, I think they like the degree to which the U.S. and its allies are tied down dealing with this, which prevents us from devoting the kind of redeployment to the Pacific side that we might otherwise like to do. So anyway, that's my assessment of the conflict. You may disagree with me, but that's the way I see it. And at any rate, I'll be wrapping this up for now. And will I mention, I understand that Kimmel is back on all the ABC stations now, so he survived one way or the other. And I'll be posting this on YouTube and Rumble as always, and the address of my social media accounts are in the description below.